ocean has always been a realm of profound darkness and endless mystery, where sunlight fades into an abyssal void. For centuries, sailors have whispered tales of what lurks beneath the waves in hushed tones, while shivering against the cold salt spray. Among all the terrors that haunt the maritime imagination, none loom larger or more terrifying than the Kraken. This colossal beast is not merely an animal, but a force of nature that embodies the overwhelming power of the deep sea. It is said to rise from the darkest trenches, to drag entire ships down into the crushing depths, leaving nothing but splintered wood and silence. The legend of the Kraken is not just a story of a monster, but a ghost story of the ocean itself, where the spirits of the drowned scream in the wake of a tentacled nightmare that has prowled the waters since the dawn of time. Ancient maps often featured illustrations of sea monsters warning travelers of the dangers that lay beyond the known world. The Carta Marina, created by Aulus Magnus in the 16th century, depicted creatures so vast they could easily be mistaken for islands. These early accounts described the Kraken not as a squid, but as a crab-like leviathan or a starfish of impossible size. However, as time marched on and sailors returned with harrowing accounts, the image shifted. The Kraken became the ultimate cephalopod, a giant squid of intelligence and malice, capable of wrapping its arms around the hull of a three-masted vessel. It was the fear of being pulled into the cold, dark water that kept sailors awake at night, staring into the black abyss, wondering if a giant eye was staring back at them from the depths. Our story takes us back to the year 1874, aboard a Norwegian whaling ship named the Vermillion. Captain Eric Thorvald was a man of steel and salt, hardened by decades of hunting whales in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. He was a man who laughed at superstition and mocked the crew when they spoke of the sea devil. The Vermillion was a sturdy vessel built of heavy oak and reinforced with iron, designed to withstand the crushing pressure of pack ice. Yet even the strongest ship is but a toy in the hands of the ocean. Captain Thorvald was chasing a massive pod of sperm whales near the coast of Iceland, unaware that he was sailing directly into the hunting grounds of something far older and far hungrier than any whale. The crew of the Vermillion consisted of 30 men from various corners of the globe, all united by the promise of oil and money. Among them was a young lookout named Jonas, who possessed a sharp pair of eyes and a heart full of anxiety. Jonas had heard the stories from his grandfather about the water boiling without fire and the sea turning black as ink. As the ship ventured further north into the mist-covered waters, Jonas felt a growing sense of dread settling in his stomach. The air grew heavy and unnatural, and the usual chatter of the seabirds vanished completely, leaving an oppressive silence that rang in the ears of the men. It was as if the ocean itself was holding its breath, waiting for a violent exhale. Days turned into weeks, and the fog refused to lift, wrapping the Vermillion in a suffocating gray shroud. The compass needle began to spin erratically, refusing to settle on north, which set the crew on edge. Whispers of a curse began to circulate below deck, where the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. The men spoke of the Halfgufa, a creature from Norse sagas that would belch food to attract fish before swallowing everything in a massive vortex. Captain Thorvald silenced these rumors with harsh discipline, threatening to lash anyone who spoke of ghosts or monsters. He was determined to fill the hold with whale oil regardless of the ominous signs that surrounded them. One evening, as the twilight bled into the ink of night, the water around the ship became strangely calm. The waves ceased their rhythmic slapping against the hull, and the surface became as smooth as black glass. It was an unnatural stillness that made the hair on the arms of the sailors stand up. Jonas was up in the crow nest, straining his eyes against the gloom when he saw it. A massive disturbance in the water, half a mile off the starboard bow. It was not a whale breaching, nor was it a wave breaking. It looked as though a massive island was rising from the depths, pushing the water aside with colossal force. The ocean churned and foamed white, contrasting violently against the dark sea. Captain Thorvald rushed to the deck telescope, in hand barking orders to bring the ship about. He believed they had found the mother lode of whales, a pod so large it disturbed the surface for miles. But as the Vermillion drew closer, the smell hit them. It was not the salty tang of the sea or the smell of whale blubber. It was a rotting musk, a stench of decay and ancient slime that made the men gag and cover their faces. The water around the ship began to darken, turning a murky brown, as if millions of gallons of ink had been released from below. The silence of the night was broken by a low, vibrating hum that seemed to resonate through the very timbers of the ship, shaking the bones of everyone on board. Suddenly, the water erupted directly alongside the ship, sending a cascade of freezing spray over the deck. A tentacle thicker than the main mast of the ship shot out of the water and slammed onto the deck with the weight of a falling tree. The wood shattered, instantly sending splinters flying like shrapnel. The men screamed in terror, scrambling backwards as the slimy appendage writhed and felt around, seeking something to grasp. It was covered in suckers the size of dinner plates, each one lined with razor-sharp hooks that tore into the wood and flesh alike. This was no whale. This was the doom they had whispered about in the safety of the taverns on land. Captain Thorvald stood frozen for a moment, his mind unable to comprehend the scale of the horror before him. He drew his wailing harpoon and roared a command, rallying his men to fight. Dozens of sailors grabbed axes and lances, hacking wildly at the massive limb that blocked their path. blood sprayed from the wounds covering the men in a toxic slime that burned their skin. But for every blow they struck the beast seemed only to get angrier. Another tentacle rose from the port side, then another and another, until the Vermillion was surrounded by a forest of writhing flesh. The ship groaned in protest as the beast began to squeeze, compressing the hull with hydraulic power. The ship listed violently to the side, throwing men across the deck like ragdolls. Lanterns smashed, igniting small fires that cast a hellish orange glow over the scene. Through the chaos and the smoke, Jonas looked over the railing and saw the face of the monster. Rising from the black water was a beak unlike anything in nature, sharp and cruel, capable of snapping the keel of the ship in a single bite. But it was the eye that stole his soul. A gigantic, unblinking orb the size of a carriage wheel stared up at him with a cold, malign intelligence. It was not the eye of a mindless animal, but of a thinking, feeling entity that understood exactly what it was doing. The Kraken tightened its grip, and the sound of snapping timber echoed like gunshots across the water. The main mast cracked at the base and came crashing down, crushing the lifeboat and trapping several men beneath its weight. Screams of agony merged with the roaring of the beast and the creaking of the dying ship. Captain Thorvald, realizing his pride had led them to their doom, charged the beast with a desperate finality. He hurled his harpoon directly at the giant eye. The iron struck true, sinking deep into the jelly-like surface. The monster let out a sound that was not a roar, but a high-pitched shriek that shattered the glass of the compass and brought men to their knees, clutching their bleeding ears. Enraged by the pain, the Kraken redoubled its attack. It pulled the Vermillion downward, violently dipping the bow beneath the freezing waves. Water rushed onto the deck, sweeping men into the icy embrace of the ocean. Those who fell into the water were snatched up instantly by the smaller feeder tentacles, dragged into the waiting beak of the Leviathan. It was a massacre, a feeding frenzy that turned the sea red with blood. Jonas clung to the rigging high above the carnage, watching his friends and shipmates disappear one by one. He saw the captain snatched from the quarterdeck, his body crushed like a twig, before vanishing into the maw. The ship was now at a 45-degree angle, sliding rapidly into the deep. The pressure of the water caused the remaining air pockets in the hull to explode, sending geysers of spray into the night air. The Vermillion, which had been a home and a fortress, was now a tomb. Jonas knew he had mere seconds before the suction of the sinking vessel pulled him down with it. He took a breath of the smoke-filled air and leaped from the rigging, aiming for a piece of drifting wreckage far from the reach of the tentacles. The freezing shock of the water hit him like a hammer, knocking the wind from his lungs. Jonas surfaced, gasping for air, his limbs numb from the cold. He scrambled onto a large section of the hull that had been torn away, shivering uncontrollably. From his precarious vantage point, he watched the final moments of the Vermillion. The ship was enveloped by the massive arms of the Kraken, pulled inexorably into the abyss. The stern rose high into the air for a brief moment, a tombstone marking the grave of 30 men, before slipping beneath the surface with a terrifying gurgle. The ocean swirled in a massive vortex, churning with debris and foam before slowly settling back into an eerie calm. Alone in the middle of the Atlantic, Jonas drifted on his raft of wreckage. The darkness was absolute save for the uncaring stars that looked down from the heavens. Every ripple in the water sent a spike of terror through his heart. He knew the beast was still down there, perhaps, watching him from below, waiting for him to slip or fall asleep. The psychological torture was worse than the physical cold. He could feel the gaze of the Kraken piercing through the wood beneath him. The silence of the ocean was no longer peaceful. It was a heavy blanket of dread that suffocated his hope. For 3 days and 3 nights, Jonas drifted a speck of life in an infinite graveyard. He hallucinated voices in the wind, hearing the screams of his shipmates and the roar of the monster. Dehydration and hypothermia began to claim his mind. He saw shapes moving in the water-fleeting shadows that circled his makeshift raft. Were they sharks? Or was the Kraken toying with him, saving him for a final snack? He spoke to the empty air, begging for salvation or death, unable to distinguish between the nightmare he had lived and the waking nightmare of his survival. On the morning of the 4th day, a British merchant vessel spotted the debris field. They lowered a boat and retrieved the near-frozen body of the young sailor. Jonas was delirious, his skin gray, and his eyes wide with a madness that would never fully leave him. When they pulled him aboard, he screamed not of gratitude, but of warning, grabbing the sailors and pointing frantically at the water. He babbled about the eye, the beak, and the tentacles that reached for the sky. The crew of the merchant ship pitied him, thinking him mad from exposure and the loss of his ship. Jonas was taken back to land, but he never returned to the sea. He spent the rest of his days in a sanitarium far inland, where he could not hear the sound of the waves. He would sit for hours drawing charcoal sketches of the beast, covering the walls of his cell with images of writhing tentacles and a single giant eye. The doctors called it trauma, a break from reality caused by a shipwreck. But the other sailors who visited him knew better. They saw the truth in his wild eyes. They knew that there were things in the deep that defied science and reason. The story of the Vermillion became a legend, a cautionary tale told in port taverns from London to Boston, while skeptics dismissed it as a drunken fabrication or the result of a rogue wave. The maritime community held a deep-seated respect for the unknown. In the years that followed, other ships disappeared in the same region, vanishing without a trace or a distress signal. Was it the weather, or was it the Kraken continuing its harvest? The ocean is vast and deep covering 70% of our planet. Yet, we know less about its floor than we do about the surface of the moon. Science eventually caught up with legend in the form of the giant squid, Architeuthis ducks. In the late 19th century, carcasses of these massive creatures began washing up on shores, providing physical proof that giant cephalopods existed. They were measured at lengths of up to 60 feet, with eyes the size of basketballs. While these creatures were indeed monsters of the deep, they were thought to be shy and elusive, unlikely to attack a ship. However, cryptozoologists and sailors argued that the Architeuthis was merely a smaller cousin of the true Kraken, a beast far larger and more aggressive that had yet to be catalogued by science. The legendary Kraken was said to be miles across a creature so large it could be mistaken for an island. Some theories suggest that the Kraken might not be a squid at all, but a remnant of the prehistoric era, a surviving plesiosaur, or a new species entirely that hibernates for centuries on the ocean floor. The deep scattering layer of the ocean, a zone where sonar reflects off millions of organisms, provides ample cover for such a behemoth. In the darkness of the bathypelagic zone, where pressure can crush a submarine like a soda, giants can hide effectively from the prying eyes of humanity. During the Cold War, hydrophones placed on the ocean floor to track Soviet submarines picked up a sound that baffled scientists. Named the bloop, this ultra-low frequency sound was extremely powerful and was detected by sensors thousands of miles apart. While the official explanation eventually settled on icequakes, many researchers noted that the sound profile bore a striking resemblance to a biological call. If it was a living creature, it would have to be significantly larger than a blue whale, the largest animal known to have ever lived. The location of the sound in the remote South Pacific coincided with the coordinates HP Lovecraft used for his fictional city of Arlai, home of the slumbering Cthulhu. The psychological impact of the Kraken legend speaks to our primal fear of the unknown. Thalassophobia, the intense fear of deep bodies of water, is rooted in the idea that we are not at the top of the food chain when we enter the ocean. On land, we are masters of our environment, but in the water, we are slow, vulnerable, and blind. The Kraken represents the ultimate manifestation of this vulnerability. It is the thing that grabs your leg when you tread water, the shadow that passes beneath your boat, the sudden disappearance of a swimmer in calm waters. Even in the modern era, with our steel hulls and radar technology, the ocean remains a dangerous place. Sailors on immense container ships still report strange anomalies, massive radar blips that appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly, unexplained vibrations that shudder through ships the size of skyscrapers, deep claw marks found on the hulls of submarines, and deep sea cables that have been severed by force, not friction. These incidents are often written off as mechanical failures or natural phenomena. But the old salts know better. They know the Kraken is not dead, just dormant. The interaction between the giant squid and the sperm whale is the only clash of titans we have evidence of. Whales have been found with circular scars covering their bodies, remnants of battles fought in the crushing darkness. Inside the stomachs of sperm whale scientists have found beaks of squids that suggest sizes far larger than any specimen we have recovered. This implies that there are indeed monsters down there growing to impossible sizes in the nutrient-rich waters of the deep, unconstrained by gravity. In the folklore of the Nordic countries, the Kraken was not always seen as purely evil. Some fishermen believed that the beast would drive schools of fish to the surface, creating a bounty for those brave enough to fish near it. It was a high-risk gamble, fishing above a sleeping god. If the Kraken woke, the whirlpool created by its descent would drag the fishermen to their doom. This duality of the ocean as a provider and a destroyer is perfectly encapsulated in the myth. The Kraken gives and the Kraken takes. Pierre Denis de Montfort, a French naturalist in the early 19th century, staked his career on the existence of the Kraken. He studied reports of giant octopuses attacking ships off the coast of Angola. He produced a famous drawing of a colossal octopus pulling down a 3-masted ship. The scientific community ridiculed him, and he died in poverty and obscurity. Yet decades later, the discovery of the giant squid proved that his obsession was rooted in truth. He was a man destroyed by a monster. He never saw a victim of the Kraken, just as surely as the sailors of the Vermillion. Imagine for a moment the perspective of the Kraken, an ancient intelligence drifting through the eternal night of the deep ocean. It has lived for centuries, perhaps millennia, watching the surface world change. Wooden hulls turned to iron, then to steel. The vibrations of oars were replaced by the churning of propellers. It feels the intrusion of humanity into its domain, the noise, the pollution, the drilling. Perhaps its attacks are not out of hunger, but out of defense, a territorial response to the noisy insects that skitter across the ceiling of its world. There are places in the ocean, like the Sargasso Sea or the Devil Sea, where ships vanish with alarming regularity. We draw triangles on maps and speak of magnetic anomalies or alien abductions. But perhaps the answer is far simpler and far more terrestrial. Perhaps these are the hunting grounds, the feeding pits of creatures that have ruled the oceans long before the first lungfish crawled onto land. We map the ocean floor with satellites, but the resolution is poor. A creature the size of a city block could easily hide in a trench or a canyon invisible to our instruments. As we continue to explore the deep, using robotic submersibles and manned dives, we push light into places that have known only darkness for billions of years. We may be waking things that should be left alone. Every dive is a risk, every sonar ping a dinner bell. The story of the Vermillion serves as a grim reminder that curiosity has a price. We gaze into the abyss, and we assume we are safe behind our glass and steel. But glass breaks and steel bends. The legend of the Kraken endures because it is plausible. We discover new species in the ocean every year. The coelacanth was thought extinct for 65 million years, until one was caught in a fishing net in 1938. If a fish can hide for that long, why not a super predator? The ocean is the last frontier on Earth, the final hiding place for the monsters of our nightmares. It is a vast blue curtain drawn over a stage where a terrifying drama plays out every day unseen by human eyes. So the next time you stand on the shore and look out at the horizon, remember Jonah's and the crew of the Vermillion. Remember that the calm surface is a lie, a mask that hides the chaos below. The waves that lap gently at your feet have traveled over deep trenches where light cannot reach. And somewhere in that darkness, waiting in the cold and the silence, something massive is moving. Its giant eye is open, and it is looking up, watching the shadows of our boats pass overhead, waiting for the right moment to rise again.